Welcome back to The Point, and a special episode on the by-election results that many people believe could have shaken the BJP's confidence. Let's take up that thought that Chandan Mitra raised. If Mr. Modi was a wise man, there's no doubt, Chandan Mitra, he's a wise man. The question is, what is it that he should do in response?
I never raised it.
No, not you, Shekhar, not you.
I plead guilty.
Shekhar raised it. I would assume that you would always agree with Shekhar when Shekhar says Modi is a wise man.
You mean Chandan Mitra doesn't think he's a wise man?
I would never say if. I would never say if.
Since
Shekhar said if Mr. Modi is a wise man.
We're back into terminological disputes. This time we're quarreling over the use of the word if. Let's leave the if aside.
Once a narrator, always a narrator.
Let me put this to you, Chandan Mitra. Many people believe that the first lesson Mr. Modi needs to learn is that when the Lakshmikant Bajpayis and Yogi Adityanath say these hateful things about love jihad and madrasas being terrorists, or 99.99% of all the rape accused being Muslims, Mr. Modi must admonish and silence them. Otherwise, not only does he endanger the reputation of his party and his government, but worse still, he makes his own Independence Day speech when he spoke so passionately about communal harmony, it looked like hypocrisy. Is that a lesson Mr. Modi needs to learn?
You see, Mr. Modi, as we have now all concurred, is a wise man, and I'm sure that he's either watching your program or the content of your program will be conveyed to him.
That would be a very wise thing for Mr. Modi to do, to watch our program. I must admit, on that point, I agree with you.
Your advice will obviously reach him, and it is for him to decide what he has to do. You must leave it to a man as wise, sagacious, and a first-rate strategist like him to devise a strategy. Although if you ask for my opinion, one round of election is not any reason for a knee-jerk reaction, and Mr. Modi kind of concurring with the salivating biryani walas that he must do something very, very quickly because everything is collapsing. Everything is not collapsing. Mr. Modi should simply stay the course.
Simply stay the course, and you're also suggesting no lessons to learn. But regardless of Chandan believing there are no lessons to learn, I want to put a different sort of lesson to you, Professor Hassan. The BJP at the moment is insisting that there should be an equal split of seat sharing in Maharashtra, and that the chief ministership will be given to the party that wins the most seats between the Shiv Sena and the BJP. Are there lessons for its Maharashtra policy out of this set of by-election results? Should they be more accommodating of the Shiv Sena and Uddhav Thackeray's ambitions, rather than try and insist that on the back of a Modi wave that could be diminishing, they should have equal share?
You see, before I respond to that, I think one of the lessons from this election, which speaks to the issue that you've just raised, is that apart from all the reasons that we have mentioned, I think there is a lesson for BJP here, and that is about hubris and arrogance. Because let's face it, I mean, this whole business of 282 and absolute majority and 333, clearly the issue is not complacency, but more than that, I think there was a kind of a hubris that now they're invincible. They're invincible. They can dictate terms, not just to the Congress, which of course they can, but that they could dictate terms to everybody, because for all practical purposes,
focus in on the ally Maharashtra.
So therefore, for all practical, this is supposed to be an NDA government, but it has been effectively functioning as a BJP government thanks to the 282 they have. Now that has generated, as I said, a kind of a hubris and arrogance. Now surely this result, or rather this setback, should give them some kind of sense that the kind of
focus on Maharashtra.
In Maharashtra, because obviously this is going to embolden Uddhav Thackeray in demanding that.
So the BJP should be more accommodating and less insistent.
Should be more accommodating and might even be compelled to be more accommodating.
Chandan Mitra, one other lesson that seems to emerge is that when Mr. Modi is not campaigning, it's easier to defeat the BJP. Does this suggest...
Editing correction, we just confused Chandan for Shekhar. I'm very happy to be...
That's entirely Chandan's fault, because when I first spoke to him, he thought I was talking about you. So the fault lies with him.
Right.
If there's any credit for making a mistake, I'll grab that. And my apologies for mistaking you. Let me put it like this. One of the things that is...
Chandan may worry, I'm fine.
You're happy to be mistaken for Chandan?
Absolutely.
Would you rather be Chandan?
No.
Okay. One of the things that has clearly emerged is that when Mr. Modi is not campaigning, it's easier to defeat the BJP. The charisma, the magnetism of the man adds a lot to the party. Minus it, the party is diminished. Does this suggest to you that if they want to do well in Maharashtra and Haryana, and clearly that's important, Mr. Modi might have to return to the hustings in a fairly substantial way?
Well, most certainly in full state elections, he will go and campaign. Look, it's generally a convention that the incumbent Prime Minister does not go and campaign in by-elections. Usually this has been maintained. In fact, I'm not 100% sure of whether Rajiv had gone and campaigned against VP Singh in 88 in Allahabad by-election or not.
In West Bengal, Siddharth Shankar Ray versus Bolpur.
Yeah. So usually this is not done. That's why I said I will not see it as an anti-Modi verdict. In fact, I will see the voter as being very nuancial. They voted for Modi as Prime Minister. Look, in Haryana already Congress party has found a slogan. They say, Upar Narinder, Niche Bhupinder. That, in Delhi you've got...
the French would call that coexistence.
Narendra Modi, you got Bhupinder Singh Hooda. But having said that, I will disagree with one point that Zoya made, which is that this will weaken the BJP in Maharashtra. I think in Maharashtra, Shiv Sena is now really, truly weakened. It's on the ropes.
But do you see Mr. Modi playing a bigger role in Maharashtra and Haryana?
Oh,
almost certainly.
Most certainly. He will lead those campaigns from the front.
Manishankar, another area where people wonder whether this by-election set of results is going to have an implication or a consequence is what happens in Delhi. Clearly, this is an area where state elections are due. There seems to be a set of confusion about when that will happen. Do you believe that after this, the BJP will want to delay elections in Delhi for as long as possible? Something, incidentally, which the Hindustan Times claimed last week on their front page, would suit Congress as well, even though Congress may publicly say something to the opposite. So do you see early elections or do you see further delayed elections in Delhi?
As far as the BJP is concerned, long before these results came out, they had concluded that they were losing in Delhi, which is why they were trying to prevent elections. Now, how long they can prevent elections from taking place is A for God and B for Najib Jung to decide. Perhaps they amount to the same thing. But the fact of the matter is that an election in Delhi will have to take place sooner, much sooner than later, and they'll get thrashed.
Can I put this to you? Can I interrupt? The Hindustan Times last week on its front page claimed that despite the fact that Congress is publicly calling for early elections, the truth is that in fact the Congress party wants a delay in elections because it fears that whenever elections are held, it will lose badly. Secondly, the Congress also believes that a delay in elections will reduce the appeal of the Aam Aadmi Party, and that's the second reason why Congress wants a delay. And therefore, the paper concluded that despite what the Congress says in public, you might support by not voting against a minority BJP government.
I think what the Congress knows is that whether these elections are held today or a few weeks from now, the outcome for the Congress is going to be much the same. And we, I don't think, are in a position to be able to form a government in Delhi. But yes, there is a possibility that the results will be of such a kind that the Aam Aadmi Party would need to look in our direction. That we'll see in the future. But the point is not who's going to win. The point is that an election has to be held sooner than later, and the outcome of that will not be favorable for the BJP, which after all won 7 seats in May and is now not going to get a majority at all. If they were going to get a majority, they'd be pressing for it. They know that they've lost.
In other words, this is going to reinforce their sense of doubt about Delhi. Let me put something else to you, Ashok Malik. Yogi Adityanath, famously across practically every television channel in the country last night, claimed that the BJP had actually suffered reverses because he hadn't campaigned widely enough, that he'd been stopped from doing so either by his party or by the administration. Is he a lone voice in claiming that's the reason, or would many in the party agree with him?
As I said, I didn't cover these elections in UP. I didn't travel. My information is second hand. I've heard two sets of statistics. Mr. Adityanath says he campaigned in 3 seats and they won all 3. Others say he campaigned in 7 seats and they lost 5. I don't know which one is correct. Okay, but I go back to my old position that it's not just the love jihad theme which may have become a factor in a couple of seats, or perhaps certainly in the media and in the overall messaging. But it's much more than that. I think that there are infirmities in the BJP itself. And there's one more point I'd like to make. While the Samajwadi Party has 108 seats, with of course the BSP dropping out, the Samajwadi Party itself has a lot to answer for these past 2 years, including Mr. Bhatia has mentioned the word communalism several times, including encouraging some very extreme elements who happen to be Muslim.
Except that didn't cost the Samajwadi Party.
No,
if anything, they benefited from it. But I want
true,
to come back to your earlier point about the many infirmities in the BJP. Are you also, without saying so, suggesting that the BJP hasn't done enough to tackle those infirmities, and one of the other causes is that it's been either reluctant to accept those infirmities exist or slow in tackling them?
There's something, there's a word she used, complacency, which I quite buy, because these infirmities were
Papered over
by Mr. Modi and this massive mandate he won in an entirely different election a few months ago. And there was a sense of overconfidence that we can now revive ourselves in UP. Well, I'd use the word complacency, you do the word hubris. But rebuilding a party in a state is a long haul. If you look at Rajasthan and what the Congress is doing, it's taken one step in a marathon. So,
but an incredible step that Congress took, because from a position of losing 163 out of 200 in December and all 25 out of 25 in May, they've bounced back by winning 75%.
Hats off to Sachin Pilot, who's dived in, unlike many other young leaders in the Congress, into state politics and into grassroops politics.
Having lost himself and therefore been demoralized.
Absolutely, but he's just started. It is a 5-year process, which is why rebuilding the BJP in UP is also a long-term process. It's not an overnight job.
There is a long road ahead of Sachin Pilot, but he's taken a very credible first step.
I grant him that.
Gaurav Bhatia, the Indian Express claims, and I'm now focusing narrowly on your own party, that Mulayam Singh Yadav's acumen and management played a major role in the party's victory. Do these bypolls suggest that increasingly between now and 2017, when the next UP state elections happen, it will be Mulayam Singh Yadav who slips into the driving seat with Akhilesh moving into the back seat, regardless of who keeps the title Chief Minister?
No, Karan, let us have things in the right perspective. Mr. Mulayam Singh Yadav is the national president of the party, and he's always been the driving force in the party. And after the debacle in the Lok Sabha elections, let me just apprise you that in the party also there were many organizational changes, and even in the government, Mr. Akhilesh Yadav took such drastic decisions to change top bureaucrats and other administrative persons also. That has sent out a positive signal.
Okay.
And if Mr. Mulayam Singh Yadav is guiding anybody in the party or the government, because there is an ideology that we follow, I think there is nothing wrong. But Mr. Akhilesh Yadav is the man who is in charge of state of UP in terms of governance, and he is in full command. The media I hear talks about many chief ministers and all that. I think by taking strong decisions that he has over the past few months, he's been able to dispel those notions.
All right. It's a very interesting, combination of descriptions. Akhilesh Yadav is in full command, but Mulayam Singh Yadav is the driving force. So the man in full command ain't the driving force.
Can you repeat that, Karan?
No, I won't. It was partly rhetorical and partly mischievous. I don't think it bears repetition, but I think the audience will have heard it. I want to move on. Chandan Mitra,
I would like to hear it too, if you can.
Watch the repeat. I encourage you to watch the repeat. It's at midnight tonight. Chandan Mitra, have these results taken the shine off Amit Shah?
No, on what basis? Are you even framing
You took a long time to answer that. Were you struggling with the answer?
No, because it's echoing heavily. Biryani break. It is not in my nature to take so much time, but it's echoing, and your Hindi program is also periodically coming in. So I am fighting a lot of, audio problems here, but let me not give excuses. Mr. Amit Shah has just taken over. He has actually been around, traveling to the states, getting familiar with the problems, and therefore I don't think that he should be brought into the picture at all in this particular case. You give Mr. Modi's government not 100 days but 300 days and you see the change.
All right.
And then you judge him. Then you say whether he needs to take corrective action. The only person in this round who has to take corrective action, let me tell you, is Ms. Mamta Banerjee, who is now clearly on her way out in
Well,
2016.
she's not here, nor is her party representative, so let's leave her out of this discussion. But I want to pick up very quickly and put to you the thought that Chandan had there. Give Mr. Modi 300 days, don't judge him by 100 days, and you will see dramatic action. Actually, many people wonder, after these set of setbacks, will the BJP's appetite for radical structural reform have diminished? Will we still see labour reforms? Will we still see reforms to the Land Acquisition Act? Will we even see something as simple as diesel deregulation? Though today, companies are making a 35 paisa per litre profit on diesel.
I have 2 points to make here. One, while I do agree that these results have been a setback for Mr. Modi, his government, and more so his party, I don't believe there a referendum on Mr. Modi's government, because 3 months is too quick for people to
I want to
decide.
say the referendum. I'm saying, will they in fact diminish his capacity for radical reform, because he'll be worried about the impact on the voter?
But there's no correlation between decisions his government has taken and the results of these by-elections.
At the moment, he's taken no radical decisions in terms of reform.
He's taken no decisions which have been.
Will he take them hereafter?
If you look at his record in Gujarat as chief minister, and that's all we can go by, he has not shied away from taking tough decisions, even at the cost of short-term political loss, even within his party and family, as in political family.
Manishankar Iyer, I'm going to quickly come to you before I come back to the two analysts sitting with me here in studio, Shekhar Gupta and Zoya Hassan. What's your assessment of Mr. Modi's next 4 years? To what extent has this slightly taken the wind out of his sails, and to what extent is that just journalistic exaggeration? And I know that you will want to claim that it's diminished Mr. Modi and his government's prospects, but I'm asking you to actually be honest about it as a politician rather than simply a polemicist.
As a politician, I'm also a polemicist, and I think your expression, taken the wind out of his sails, is extremely mild. I would say it's pricked his inflated balloon. The fact is, I too am waiting for these 300 days to be over, because he'd make 3 times the number of mistakes he's made in the last 100 days. The fact is that throughout this program, several of my co-panelists have been trying to draw a distinction between Modi and the BJP, and the BJP and the Sangh Parivar. They're all the same. Mr. Modi will have to undergo a lobotomy if he is not going to be dependent upon those who brought him to power. He represents them.
He drew those distinctions very sharply and effectively in Gujarat. He kept the VHP apart. He kept the RSS at arm's length. He also often, in fact, ensured that he was dominant, not the BJP. So if he could do all those 3 things in Gujarat, surely he could do them in Delhi.
So is that the reason why they did so badly in Gujarat?
Well, they actually did rather well in December 2012. He won 3 consecutive state elections.
He may have won 3 consecutive state elections, but in this election, this set of elections, which is what we are discussing, we've seen a result in Gujarat that I certainly didn't expect. I had never expected that the Congress would be able to show this kind of a life again in that state. We've done well in Rajasthan, and we didn't even compete really in Uttar Pradesh, but there is the non-BJP element in our government is coming to the fore, and I think the attempt to save Mr. Modi's neck by saying that the loss is somebody else's and Modi himself is not involved is a bogus argument, because Mr. Modi is the representative of those who have lost this election.
Let me pick up.
He chose Yogi Adityanath to lead the discussion in Parliament. It was his choice, and therefore it shows that there's not very much to choose between Adityanath
and
on the one
hand.
I want to come back
by
to
the
that
way.
thought
He made a
of
very
how much
good
the
speech.
Modi government's capacity to deliver the structural reforms that made many people vote for him is diminished by this. And I want to ask you specifically about one thing that Arun Jaitley's next budget hinges upon critically, and I imagine the ability of this government to invest for the future depends on that as well. Can he hereafter dramatically cut subsidies? He's appointed an expenditure management commission to advise him on how to do it. But you know and I know cutting subsidies is difficult. When you're a strong government with the people behind you, you can do it. When you're a government wondering whether the wind is being taken out of your sails, you begin to think twice. Will Arun Jaitley think 3 times before he cuts subsidies in February?
Well, first of all, there aren't that many subsidies left to cut when it comes to, nobody's going to cut subsidies on right to food, nobody's going to cut subsidies on Manrega, right? Because all parties voted for them. If you look at fuel, now diesel is a reform that the previous government initiated, UPA, 50 paisa per month, I call it homeopathic reform, and this one continued, except there was a 2-month break because of elections. So, and we've been helped by US finding shale gas and global oil prices being reasonable in spite of the fact that there is trouble in the Middle East. So it's a combination of many factors. A wise government would now similarly homeopathically attack LPG and say LPG goes up, say, by 5 rupees a month. Right? LPG is the most obscene subsidy in India. It goes to people who have a home and who have a kitchen.
So you're suggesting rather than dramatic and radical, he'll be cautious and sensible.
It is impossible.
But steady.
It is impossible in India for any party, even if Mr. Modi had 400 seats, would have been impossible, unless he had gone to elections with a manifesto saying, I will cut subsidies, and nobody will do that in India. Having said that, I think Mr. Modi has one advantage, that unlike the UPA, where the Congress party was always at Dr. Manmohan Singh's throat, his party or the RSS is not at his throat. So he can either ignore them.
It's at his feet instead.
Yes. So he can either ignore them or he can tell them, see, you guys make too much noise. Now you know what happens.
Will this in any sense, I'm talking about the by-election results, change the equation between the old guard and the new duo combination of Modi and Amit Shah? Or is that far too unlikely? Some papers today were speculating that the Murli Manohar Joshis, the LK Advanis might sense an opportunity to correct a balance that's gone hugely against them. Do you agree with that line of interpretation?
No, I don't agree. I think it's rather late for them to be able to reassert themselves. But to the point that you're making about economic reforms,
very quickly.
Modi, the core constituency of Modi would be expecting economic reforms, and I don't think he can afford to really disappoint them on that.
Secondly, so regardless of the setbacks, we will see radical reform?
Well, radical reforms I cannot say, but certainly economic reforms.
Okay.
And secondly, and very importantly, let's not forget that this is a very Modi-centric government. This is the PMO is running the government. Okay. So it hardly matters whether...
forgive me, I'm interrupting. In a very strange, paradoxical way, has this setback for the BJP actually ended up enhancing the importance and dominance of Mr. Modi, who remains the biggest crowd-winning, appealing, magnetic figure for the party?
It's reinforced the lessons from his mandate, which is a centrist, development-oriented mandate. But the fact is, unlike Dr. Manmohan Singh, there is no distinction between Mr. Modi and his party. So
not for you, but for many there is.
He's invested in his party. So if his party does badly, it affects him. If his party does well, it affects him.
I think his party is invested in him.
No, I think he's also very much.
I
think he's very much a BJP person. Okay. Having said that, I think a lot of the assumptions about economic reforms and what Mr. Jaitley can or cannot do will need to be revisited after the Maharashtra and Haryana elections, depending on how well the BJP does.
A setback there could be also an obstacle for Arun Jaitley.
In government in both those states, we could be talking a different
language. I'm sorry, I've run right out of time. I know your finger's gone up and you wanted to say something, but I'm going to have to stop you because we're horribly out of time.
We should not forget that he won 31% of the vote, and that was predominantly middle class.
All right, and predominantly middle class, 31% of the vote. But please add to that it was a bigger share than any other single party, because that's
much bigger than India.
My thanks to all three of you for coming to studio. My thanks also to Chandan Mitra, Gaurav Bhatia and Manish Shankaraya for joining me from their respective residences.
Chandan Mitra is enjoying a biryani.
Thanks for watching. Goodbye.
But that was really gross.